Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name's Luke Douglas, and I'm a master's student under Dr. Amber Roth at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. And over the past couple of years, we've been working in tandem with Dr. Carol Foss of the New Hampshire Audubon to study the threatened rusty blackbird, in particular, how the species uses intensively managed forests within its breeding range. And while the project is still far from over, I'd like to tell you a bit about our work and what we've been able to accomplish so far. So I know everyone should be familiar with the rusty blackbird and the problems it's facing, so I'll keep this brief for the members of the audience who may just be joining our symposium. But the species gets its name from its non-breeding plumage, which features these rusty brown feather tips, which then fade away to the glossy black that we know for the breeding season. And the species breeds from westernmost Alaska across the Canadian boreal forest to the Maritimes and the East Coast, and winters in the southeastern coastal plain and the Mississippi alluvial valley. The big issue, and really why we're here today, is that the species is facing crisis. The rusty blackbird population is believed to have declined by over 85% since the 1970s. And this alarming decline has resulted in the species being placed on several state and federal conservation lists in the US as well as Canada, as well as the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. And while several hypotheses have been proposed to explain this trend, none have been able to fully account for the decline. So the rusty blackbird is a spruce-fir obligate. They rely on young, dense stands of softwood for nesting, and they also heavily rely on freshwater boreal wetlands as foraging habitat, as they subsist almost entirely on aquatic invertebrates. So I took these pictures last field season. On the right here, you can see a foraging wetland that was used by our birds, and on the left, you have kind of a typical nesting stand with that young, dense softwood. And the birds can be seen kind of commuting between these two types of areas. The males will also provision for the females on the nest when they're incubating. And so our team is really interested in investigating issues affecting the species on these breeding grounds in northern New England, which brings me to forestry. So forestry really plays an integral role in New England, where in Maine alone, the forest industry contributes about 1.8 billion to the state economy and employs about 24,000 people. In fact, over 75% of the land in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine is forested, and 70% of those forests are harvested timberlands that are privately owned. So, with such a large portion of available forests being privately owned, it's essential that they're managed sustainably and with wildlife in mind. And this importance is heightened by the region's, particularly Maine's, role as a baby bird factory, where over 90 species breed in the state. This high species richness is largely due to the fact that the region is home to the Acadian forest, which is an ecological transition zone between the pure boreal forest to the north and the more hardwood dominated forest to the south. So this map here shows in green the region that is the Acadian forest. So historically, the Acadian forest underwent several natural disturbance agents, including spruce budworm, windthrow, and beaver dams and flowages. And these disturbance events remove the overstory and allow for that young, dense softwood to grow in that the rusties use so much. Though with the increased prevalence of commercial forestry, much of the disturbance in New England is anthropogenic. So it's important to consider how these changes could be impacting wildlife. So, intensive forestry practices in the region include management plans that feature planted stands, naturally regenerating stands, and stands that have undergone pre commercial thinning. And pre commercial thinning involves going in and clearing the trees around the desirable market trees to promote their growth. And past work with other species has shown that thinning can improve populations of some species while decreasing those of others, even having them sometimes. And crucially, the rusty blackbird has not been comprehensively assessed for how these intensive practices affect their population. So additionally, another important facet of the bird's breeding ecology is fledgling habitat use, because work with other species has shown that fledglings often use areas with different habitat characteristics than their parents do for nesting. So just because you're protecting that nesting habitat doesn't mean that the young of a given year are actually reaching maturity and surviving to the next. So that's kind of important to look at. So that's really kind of where we come in, where we've been looking at rusty blackbird nesting and fledgling habitat selection and survival in these intensively managed spruce fir forests. And we've hypothesized that these practices can provide quality habitat when applied near their foraging wetlands. But we're hoping to use any new information that we find to inform future management decisions and revise future current plans. I should mention that I'll only be talking about habitat selection today. I won't really be going into survival. So we've been working at two different study sites, one in Coos and Oxford counties in New Hampshire and Maine, where on the left here, where demographic work has been conducted with the species since 2010 by Dr. Carol Foss of the New Hampshire Audubon. And this land is managed by Wagner and Umbagog National Wildlife Refuge. And then we have a new site in Franklin County, Maine, that's managed by Weyerhaeuser, which has more instances of that intensive forestry practices that we're interested in looking at. So through this multi-site approach, we're hoping to assess rusty blackbird response to kind of a wide range of forestry practices. So rusties start arriving to the breeding grounds in late April and early May. So that's when we begin posting up in wetlands that are near young softwood stands and watch for that commuting behavior that I talked about earlier. So once the nest has been found and nestlings are around 7 to 9 days of age, we capture the whole family group for banding. So when we capture them, we're going to put just a normal aluminum band on them as well as color bands for individual identification in the field. And then one or two fledglings from each nest are also going to be fit with radio transmitters so that we can track them throughout the field season, which you can see we're doing here with our Yagi antennas. And we're going to take those GPS points and record pertinent information such as the status of the bird in the presence of other fledglings and adults. So all of these fledgling GPS points as well as nest points are going to be paired with random points, and then so we can compare habitat characteristics at both use and available sites in a paired point site attribute design. And that's going to allow us to hone in on what characteristics are being preferentially selected for. And we're going to do this at both at the stand level and the within stand level. And I'll talk about how we're going to do that in a moment. So before we can really start talking about selection, we need to define what is available to a bird for both nesting and fledgling use. So since rusties are so closely associated with wetlands, we're going to kind of allow wetlands to dictate what is available. So for any wetland that has a nest within 300 meters, we'll take a 300-meter buffer around the wetland, and anything within that buffer or within the wetland itself will be considered available, while anything outside will be considered unavailable. And we chose 300 meters because that was the distance from wetlands that contained 90% of our nests for the first year of the study. Fledglings, on the other hand, are a little bit trickier because they have limited mobility at first, which rapidly increases as the season goes on. So to account for this, we're going to use kind of a moving window where availability will be defined on how far any bird of that age moved. So this is kind of what that's going to end up looking like, where from day one to another it could increase. And so anything within there will be available, and outside of it will be considered unavailable. So we'll be taking actual on-the-ground measurements around nests and their associated random points, including the percent cover of herbs, shrubs, and trees, the number of woody stems, canopy cover with a moose horn, total basal area taken with a prism, as well as the basal area of young softwood species, which I'm going to say a couple more times, which is defined as a tree with a diameter at breast height of 10 centimeters or below. And then we're also going to be taking GIS metrics, including proportion of softwoods around the nest, proportion of wetland, proportion of low slope soils, as well as recent thinning, older thinning, and total thinning, distance to National Hydrology dataset flow lines, as well as LIDAR derived data metrics, including canopy height and canopy cover. And fledglings will largely be following suit, although we won't be taking on-the-ground measurements just because of logistical constraints. So we're going to be relying more on LIDAR and GIS metrics to kind of hone in on what they're selecting for. So to touch briefly on our analysis, we we'll first optimize the GIS-derived variables for scale from buffers of 30, 50, 70, and 100 meters, and whatever comes out on top for a given variable will be what we use in subsequent models. And we're going to use correlation to identify variables that are highly correlated and remove the one that ranks lower according to AIC. And then we'll take the remaining variables and create final univariate and multivariate models and choose the best ranked of those models to create resource selection functions. So with that, I'd like to talk briefly about what we've actually done so far. These are some photos I took last summer showing some nestlings with the radio transmitters. You can see the antennas peeking out above their backs, as well as a nest we found. And birds were confirmed nesting in regenerating clear-cut stands that have been pre-commercially thinned, as well as freshwater wetlands. And we found a total of 23 nests in New Hampshire and 9 in Maine. We're hoping to be able to find more in Maine this coming year because of the birds' high site fidelity. So since we have these 9 locked down, it should be easier. And so this just depicts how far some of these fledglings can move. The numbers indicate days since fledge. So you can see 0 is actually where the nest site was in that left image there. And you can see they're staying fairly close to the nest within the first week. But then on the right here, you can see they start making these big movements from 7, 8, 9, and 10. You can see how far apart they are. So tracking these fledglings has proven to be an interesting challenge. So with that, I'd like to share some of our preliminary results, but with the big disclaimer that we still have a full field season ahead of us, so these could change. But our top-ranked models for nests at the stand scale include canopy height as derived from LiDAR and percent cover of boreal wetlands on a quadratic curve, which you can see to the right here. And this AIC table just shows their top 4 models of many more that were ranked. But this suggests that Rusties are selecting for canopy heights below 5 meters, and there's kind of a sweet spot in there for wetland cover by the nest, although you can see the confidence intervals are rather large. So I'm curious to see how that changes with another field season's worth of data. So as for the within stand scale, the measurements that we took on the ground in a 5-meter radius, the top ranked model included canopy cover and basal area of small softwoods, which again were defined as anything with a diameter breast height of 10 centimeters or below. So you can see we're hoping that some of these intervals might tighten up, and we'll see how that changes with another field season. And finally, fledglings. But as for them, I first want to note that we're still waiting on some data from our collaborators. So these results only include Maine birds and do not include some stand and wetland information. But currently, the top ranking model includes low slope soils, so it's from 0 to 8%, and a relative number of small trees. And this data suggests that they're favoring those kind of wetter, low slopes areas. Which kind of, and with fewer trees, which kind of coincides with what we were seeing in the field because they're mostly sticking to wetlands, it seems. So looking forward, we have a full second field season planned for summer 2021, which was originally planned for 2020, but unfortunately the whole world's kind of been put on hold by the COVID-19 pandemic, so we had to cancel this summer's field season. But one thing we're really excited about is next field season we'll be incorporating areas held by Seven Islands Land Company into the project, which contains more instances of that pre-commercial thinning. So we're curious to see what goes on there and also to collect more data. So before we wrap up, I'd just like to mention that the International Rusty Blackbird Working Group will be holding a workshop on October 7th and 9th. Via Zoom. So if you're interested, I encourage you to join us, and more info can be found at rustyblackbird.org. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge all the people and agencies that have helped us over the past couple of years. I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Ambroth, as well as Carol Foss, Dr. Adrian Leppold from the MDIFW, Dr. Cynthia Lofton and Dr. Aaron Weiss-Kittle are my own committee members from helping me, and all of our great support from UMaine itself, MDIFW, the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund, Maine Audubon, New Hampshire Audubon, Wagner, Weyerhaeuser, Maphis, and our amazing donors from experiment.com, which really helped us out, and William P. Wharton Trust and CFRU as well. So with that, normally I would take questions, but obviously we can't do that given our new format. So I'll just direct you to my email. If you have any questions or just want to talk about the project, I'd be happy to. But also we're having a Q&A session on October 2nd from 2 to 3. So I encourage you to join us there. So thanks very much, and I hope everyone has a great remainder of their day. I'm going to close this out.